All right. Welcome. Let's begin with a story. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 7. The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. So Christmas comes to Baker Street as Holmes and Watson go on a wild goose chase with a difference. It is the day after Christmas, and Watson pops into Baker Street to check on his friend. He finds Holmes carefully examining a hat. So Watson asks him about the hat. Holmes explains the events of that morning. A policeman had witnessed an attack in the street where a man lost not only his hat, but a goose to be cooked for Christmas. The goose had a small card on it reading, "For Mrs. Henry Baker." While the initials HB are visible inside the hat, there are thousands of Bakers and hundreds of Henry Bakers in the city. So the policeman brought the hat to Sherlock Holmes to see if he could deduce who is the owner. Our story picks up as the two are conversing. The owner of this trophy is unknown. I ask that you look upon it as an intellectual problem. What clue do we have as to his identity? Only as much as we can deduce. From his hat? Precisely. You are joking, right? What can you possibly gather from this old battered hat? Here is my lens. You know my methods, Watson. What can you deduce? What can you infer from as to the individuality of the man who has worn this article? It's a hat. I can see nothing. On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything. You fail, however, to reason from what you see. You are too timid in drawing your inferences. Okay, then, what can you infer from this hat? Well, there are a few inferences which are very distinct and a few others which represent at least a strong probability. That the man was highly intellectual is, of course, immediately obvious. And also that he was fairly well off within the last 3 years, although now has fallen upon hard times. He had foresight, but now less so, pointing to a moral retrogression, which when taken with his decline in fortunes, would seem to indicate some evil influence at work upon him, perhaps alcohol. This may also account for the obvious fact that his wife has ceased to love him. He has, however, retained some sense of self-respect. He is a man who leads a sedentary life. He goes out very little. He's out of shape. He's middle-aged, has grizzled hair, which he has had cut within the last few days. Well, these are the strongest facts which are to be deduced from his hat. Oh, also, it is extremely improbable that he has gas lighting inside his house. You are certainly joking, Holmes. Not in the least. Is it possible that even now, when I give you these results, that you are unable to see how they are attained? Holmes proceeds to connect all of the details of what he sees in the hat to the inferences that he just made until Watson is completely satisfied with the explanation. Then the story continues for another day. All right. On our main topic for today, circuitry sensing. So welcome to the 2021 spring edition of the GTA Coach Retreat. So the theme of coaching remote teams. This is a topic that seems very timely. It's one that's come up and gone sort of over the last several years. And, you know, I like to unpack questions. And one of the first ones is, well, what is a team? Before we can talk about what is a remote team, are there degrees of remoteness? What does it mean to coach? But let's start with what is a team? A team, you know, here's one definition: a group of individuals all working together for a common purpose. So there's three basic elements that we're looking for here. There's the individuals, the interactions between them, and some kind of shared goal. Now, this definition is a loose definition. There's many, they're all fairly similar, and they all have these three elements: that there's the people, the interactions, and the shared goals. So again, if we're looking at coaching remote teams, then what is a team? And then actually let's focus on just the individual. Because if we're trying to coach up and outwards and trying to generalize things, are we actually aware of each of the individual elements? Okay, so let's begin our first activity. I don't want to give you any prep for this. So I'm going to give you two ideas, two topics, and we're going to break out into breakout sessions in approximately 2.5 minutes. So you're going to have two ideas and you're going to get into pairs. And just flip a coin, decide who goes first. It doesn't matter, just pick someone. So there's kind of like two parts to the activity. The first is this baselining. So the first person, you're the explorer. You will take the idea, first one, and then you will say, okay, how does it feel? In fact, the two ideas that we're going to explore are going to be: think of someone that you love, and think of someone that you opposite of love, whether it's someone that you hate or strongly dislike or has really ticked you off for some reason. So let's have the explorer first close your eyes and say, okay, I'm thinking about somebody that I love. And then just feel that just for a few seconds while the observer is silently watching you. There's no talking there. And then sort of shake it off. And then you close your eyes again and you say, okay, I'm now thinking about someone that I hate or strongly dislike. Close your eyes. Just sort of sense it, feel it. And when I say feel it, you know, use all of your memories for, like, you know, what were the sounds like, the visuals, auditory, any feels, temperature, you know, indoors, outdoors, smells, you know, so think of, like, actually be in that state, in that moment where you're in the presence of someone that you love or someone that you don't. And then afterwards, then shake it off again. This is like tasting a wine. And that's what this activity is actually very much like. It's like wine tasting. So you're going to take a sip, you're going to taste that emotion, taste that memory, and then you'll shake it off and then do the same thing. So that's the baselining part. And then next, what we're going to have is the actual activity. So the explorer, pick one, A or B, someone you love, someone you hate. You don't announce it though. You're silently choosing one. Close your eyes. And again, remember that state of being with that person. Then open your eyes, and your observer now will state the guess. You were thinking about someone that you love. Or you can say it was the first one or it was the second one. There's no explanations and you don't need to give any details, right? So it's basically, was it A? Was it B? And you repeat this loop until there's 3 correct guesses. So 50-50 chance at most, you should do this like 6 times. But I think it'll be clear as you get into this activity of what the rhythm is like. And then once the observer has guessed correctly 3 times, you switch. The observer now becomes the explorer. Again, think of someone that you love. That's what you're going to experience, and then it just repeats. And then once you've done them both, you can return back to the room. Little note up in the corner: video is required as this is an observation activity. And to help out, just in case this activity is new for some, I know that it's not for one person on the call. Here's a little demo. And there is no audio here, so it's circuitry sensing. 2 participants. I've done it with 3 before, but our friend Mike Bowler. Now, my part of the video is sped up a little, but it's think of something positive. So you'll see me wiggle in fast time. So that was just me thinking about something positive. Our observer says, yep, got it. All right, shake it off. Think of something negative. So that's it. There's no tricks here. Shake it off again in fast time. All right, now pick one. And that's it. So that's your little taste. What did you see? All right. So you just repeat until there's 3 correct guesses, and then switch places between the observer and the explorer. All right. So that was our intro to the first activity. Any questions? No? All right. So Mike, if you would please.
Got 10 minutes in pairs.
10 minutes in pairs, and feel free to return anytime before, or if you're done earlier. The debrief. This was all about magic. That's my gold star. There we go. Put the gold star in front. All right. So this was all about the magic. So what did you see?
It's easy. The one thing I observed was you get to that positive place, you can't help but notice the sides of the mouth just kind of ever so slightly go up, you know. It doesn't
hard
matter
to
how.
hide this happiness.
Yeah, exactly. So your poker face is shot, you know. To borrow what Danny was saying to me about poker face.
But you won though.
It's not about winning, man. It's all about getting to know each other.
All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll go. Jose was fascinating. I noticed just some real subtleties and nuances in the facial gestures and the way the light was hitting his half of his face. I could see the difference in the muscle reaction between positive and negative. And then also when it was on the positive, just a slight uplift. And I'm like, ooh, this is interesting to watch.
Nice, nice. Good. Anyone else?
I could see that there is a little bit of extra effort that is needed to remain sad or angry as compared to feel happy. You know, that's more natural. It comes out. But if if you want to project a sad face, then you have to make a little bit of effort.
And it takes a time to shake off the bad ideas or the negative thoughts.
Yeah, like, ooh, I don't want to think about that anymore.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Andy has his hand up.
Yeah, I want to answer more on the meta level. It's because we had this at our mentorship program, and there's a latest studies about this because they question about the remote working as well, and they found out with the latest studies that you could read emotions better with auditory. And we tested out with mentees where we had a session, and it's like, listen to this auditory only, and then next with video. And they actually detect more emotions through auditory. So that's, I'm just saying it's sometimes I could read, because our session was about reading the room. So they read better the room without the camera on than the camera on, with the camera off than camera on, because most of the time in sessions, you have people camera off. And also the latest book, Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell, he studied his facial expression as well. So it's like if North American facial expressions are these cues, and we actually see Friends, the series comedy, that the face reactions are supposed to act this way. So we thought it would be universal. So they went to a Polynesian island. They say they show the face. Is this a cue that you guys read? It's like, we have no clue. What is this? You know, and they have different facial cue based on culture as well. So we're saying this is not a universal human being of facial expression. It's something we express because we mimic what we learn from movies and TVs. It's not like something that we expect to do. And there's other studies following that. A German study says, look, we surprise someone, their surprise face is not the surprise face you think. This is we expect the surprise face from TV, but it's not the surprise face when we surprise someone in a setting.
Right. Excellent points. Thank you. And you're sort of leading into some topics that I'm going to cover in upcoming slides. So first, auditory versus visual, you're correct. And I think if it's not the next slide, it's like the one coming up next is going to talk about how we hear and see and understand more. This particular activity is focused on the visual sense of what we see. We could do something also with the auditory, but the activity actually has two parts. It makes no assumptions of what you're talking about in the studies. Very flawed. I've read all that research. The assumptions that the psychologists were making was that these expressions are universal, and turns out that they aren't. So in this activity, this is why there's two parts. There's the baselining, which is, what is this to you? And the observer notices that. And then there's the activity part, which is just pick one. Because you've already seen that baseline, this activity should work anywhere on Earth, which is go to anyone and say, hey, what would it be like if you had stubbed your toe? Versus, hey, what would it be like to eat your favorite delicacy? It's like, oh, I love that. It's like mouth watering. It's like, okay, now pick one. It's like, oh yeah, the mouth is watering. I know which one you're thinking about, right? So, so this activity is a little different from that research, although I will talk a little bit about that particular research. And that's why we're focusing just on the visual at this part. The magic hat. The reason why the magic hat is I love all the little details that I've heard, which is, oh, I see the curve, the lips just curl up a smidgen, or maybe the cheek muscles, or the smiles are in the eyes. It's like, so I like that you're noticing and observing things, and that I've heard a number of coaches say, well, now that we're remote, I can't pick up on these cues. And I'm like, well, let's go back to what Sherlock Holmes said to his friend Watson. It's like, you fail to reason from what you see. You can see everything, but are you making these inferences, or are you too timid to do that? And so the magic here is like, let's not talk about the science. What does it feel like, right? And so let's continue our journey here. All right. Debrief the magic. We've gone through that. Now, this is where we're acknowledging that communication is more than just words. So when some external event happens, our 5+ senses detect billions of bits of information per second. And this is where the science gets a little, it's a little sketchy as to how much information we are picking up at every single second, but it's clearly in the billions. And so based on this, then there's some sort of a response. There's a behavior, it's what we express, what we say, what we do. And this is sort of like the outward appearances. This is what is evidence to the world. However, when we sort of peek inside the box, we can see that there's like 10 billion bits of information per second. So we would go crazy if we actually tried to process all of that information. So we have certain filters, and I'm going to skip all the scientific names, but we have certain filters, and one of them in particular has 3 primary filters that it uses. Generalize, which is, okay, I've got all this information. It's a warm, sunny day. It's a warm, sunny day. That's all I need. Just generalize. It's going to distort some of the information and or just delete. I'm just going to ignore it until what you're left with is somewhere in the order of like 4 to 8, 4 to 9 bits of information per second. This is now what we are actively thinking. And then from there, it gets into an internal representation. It gets coded in sort of our memories, time, space coding. What is our current state of mind? And that ties in with our values, our beliefs, decision-making rules, language, culture. And then it also mixes in with our physiology as well. And then that is what leads to a response. That is what leads to the behavior that we see. So now all of this takes place in a second or less, right? So an external event comes in, all of this information, we filter it out, and then there's a response. And so over on the right-hand side here, we see that communication is about 10% words, 35% tonality, and 55% physiology. So what Andy was saying was like, hey, if I just turn off the video and I just listen, that's the tonality. And so now you can see that we've gone from 10% of, what did I read in this email? It's like, oh, well, that person's a jerk. I'm like, well, hold on, that's just the words. Talk to the person, what do I hear now? So with the audio and the tonality, I've now gotten up to 45% understanding the message. And this is where today's activity focuses on the physiology. What do we see? How are we connecting? What are the different cues and clues that we can use to make our deductions and our inferences? So yes, tonality, totally on board with it. But today I flipped a coin. I went with the one that gives you the biggest bang for the buck. So that's what we're practicing today, which is the physiology response. So reading physiology, key question, what do you see? Look at the posture, the gestures, the facial expressions, the blink rate, breathing, it's like, are they breathing quickly? Are they breathing relaxed? So it's all very subtle things in terms of the auditory. What do you hear? So that's also a reflection of the current state of mind or the current state of being for the person. The tone, the tempo, the volume, the emphasis. So these convey the context, the emotions, memories, meaning, intentions, so much richer. And so now I have a video that we can watch that gives us...
Nonverbals are anything that communicates but is not a word. The public knows them as body language. How we dress, how we walk, have meaning, and we use that to interpret what's in the mind of the person. My name is Joe Navarro, and for 25 years I was a special agent with the FBI. My job was to catch spies. Most of my career I spent within the National Security Division. A lot of it had to do with looking at specific targets, and then it was about, well, how do we get in their heads and how do we neutralize them? Our security is based on nonverbals. We look at the person through the peephole. We look at who's behind us at the ATM machine. We know from the research that most of us select our mates based on nonverbals. So we may think we're very sophisticated, but in fact, we are never in a state where we're not transmitting information. There's a lot of myths out there. The ones that stand out is if you cross your arms, that it's a blocking behavior. That's just nonsense. Even when you don't like the person that is in front of you, this isn't to block them out, it's actually to self-soothe. Because in essence, it's a self-hug. When you're sitting at a movie and you're watching, you're gonna cross your arms. You're waiting for somebody, you tend to do this. What's interesting is we do this behavior more in public than in private. The other one that really stands out is as we think about something, we may look in a certain way. As we process the information, we may look in another way. It's certainly not indicative of deception, and it really shouldn't be used that way. All we can say is the person is processing the information. The other misconceptions are that if the person clears their throat, touches their nose, or covers their mouth, they're lying. We do these behaviors as self-soothers. They're pacifying behaviors. Scientifically and empirically, there's just no Pinocchio effect. And people who prattle that and say, well, we can detect deception because the person touches their nose or covers their mouth, that's just sheer nonsense. We humans are lousy at detecting deception.
All right, so that was the start of a video on reading body language. And I picked this clip because these are all things that we can see in the visual range for video that we're watching. But the video actually goes on to look at, how you're leaning and standing and your feet and, the whole body. But, think about some of the things, maybe some of the assumptions that people make. Say, oh, well, she crossed her arms. You know what that means? I'm like, I know. What does that mean? So beware some of the inferences that we make. And I really like that little clip of what he showed. So let's watch another one.
Today, we're going to focus on the face. When it comes to nonverbals, the face is key. There's so much information and feelings that we receive from the face that for us, the face takes primacy. So one of the ways to look at the face is to think of it in two areas, comfort and discomfort, because really that's how the brain reacts to the world. So let's start with psychological comfort. When we're very comfortable, the muscles of the face become very relaxed, and we have all the behaviors that are associated with it, smiling, laughing. Usually the pupils are slightly wider, the lips are full, and usually the chin tends to be further out. The very second that there's psychological discomfort, usually it begins to register in several areas. Now, for some people, we'll see it in the forehead and here between the eyes, where there'll be furrowing of the forehead or squinting. And of course, the tucking down of the chin, or in some instances where something is really emotional, you'll see the chin begins to vibrate. Covering of the eyes also is a display of psychological discomfort. So our faces, what we feel in that moment, is immediately displayed by our nonverbals. And the easiest way to look at it is that behavior consistent with comfort, or is it consistent with discomfort? One of the questions that I'm often asked is, how do we read each other? How do we read each other's faces? We start with the hair, how it's combed, what color it is. Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it curly? Is it disarranged? As children, we play with each other's hair. We look at each other's hair. We immediately notice when it's wet or dry or it's changed in some form. We look at the forehead for information. When it's smooth, the forehead tells us that everything is well and placid. When it's furrowed, we begin to notice that perhaps there's some sort of discomfort. The eyebrows. The arching of the eyebrows is our exclamation point. Doing that eyebrow flash when we see someone we recognize and we go, hey, how are you? The glabella, this little area between the eyes. Someone says something we don't like, and we might squint at them and look at them askance. The nose. Do we wrinkle our nose upward? We do that bunny nose. At about 3 months of age, babies are already doing this when they don't like something they're being offered. And then there's the lips, which convey so much information. Maybe as often as the eyes, I'm asked about smiles. We have the social smile. The interested smile. The curious smile. We have little secretive smiles that we might give to someone that we're interested in. There is so much to our mouths. It's so expressive, but starting at a very young age, we're already focusing on these things. You may not notice, for instance, the pupils, whether they're wide or narrowed, but subconsciously your brain is assessing this information. There's just so much there. So we never stop communicating with our faces. It is something that is always telegraphing our emotions and our sentiments, and sometimes even our desires.
Right, another good clip from Joe Navarro. So let us do this activity again. So same thing, we'll be given two ideas. In this case, I'll leave it fairly open as well, which is just think of something that is a great positive experience for you that was in the past. And think of something that was a negative experience. So something a great positive experience or a negative experience. So those are your two ideas that you'll be working with. So Mr. Kaufman, if you can get us into our breakout rooms again, and let's do that for another 10 minutes. All right, see you back here.
Yeah. All right, and we're back.
Another 5 minutes on the clock. All right, so putting on our science hat now, our detective cap. So what happened this time?
Well, I think we kind of knew what to look for rather than just use our own intuition. We, knew some strategies to for figuring things out and, how people work.
Cool, cool. And was that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As able to scan the face a little bit, quicker and more efficiently, and and have some, I think, just the confidence to, to confirm my instinct, I guess, right? And it's like, I kind of feel this is someone, but oh yeah, lips curled up, got it.
Nice, nice, good. Anyone else?
And I'd like to add to that as well, like when stuff and like facial expression was kind of changing or it wasn't like extremely obvious, then like looking to the breathing as well to see how like the breathing actually shifted during different emotions became helpful.
Good, nice.
For me, I had a much more accurate experience the second round after getting tips. But one thing that we all realized was that the differences are subtle, and you really have to pay attention if you really want to pick up on them consciously. Like I realize our subconscious probably picks it up far faster than we do. And then it's a question about how connected are we with our subconscious and really understanding and be able to process properly. But to be conscious of it, you really have to pay attention and observe intently.
Right. Good point. Thank you. And that was actually, I was telling Mike during the first break, that was why when I was reading the Sherlock Holmes story and I saw this part and I'm like, this is it. This is the line. Watson says, I give up. I can't see anything. And Holmes is like, no, you see everything, but you're failing to reason from what you see. And this activity is structured in such a way to say, look, when you see this, maybe it gives you a clue. Pick up on this. What can you deduce or infer? And infer is not an assumption. It's not a conclusion, but it's all little pieces of data that we might be ignoring in the past. So that's why this part is the science. The first was just, again, like Scott said, what does your intuition say? But this time, notice these things, and they happen quick, like Leslie said. It's like, oh, that's quick. Cool. Anyone else?
I just want to acknowledge, I was with Mike Bowler, and he taught me how to feel the Force, which kind of reminds me of the Star Wars movie, which is I was overthinking it, and you just kind of go with your first thought and just, express that. And it seemed to be more effective for me anyways.
Excellent. Getting out of your own way. Right. So to Ron's point, it's like our bodies are taking in all of this information all of the time, but we're not consciously aware of it. And to Mike Bowler's point is like, just, what, your unconscious has this information. What is that first instinct? Listen to that first voice. And Mike would probably go on to, oh, he got multiple brains. And he's right. But, it's like, listen to your body. And what does that first instinct say? And go with that. Don't then talk yourself into another explanation, right? Cool. Good stuff. Anyone else?
Well, there's some people that are really hard to read. Like even when I meet him in person and see him right here, Paul's always smiling. So I don't know how you can read him if he's really thinking negative thoughts, because Jesus, Paul, always smiling.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Ron.
You're welcome.
I'm just thinking about the balance about training our intuitions, because when we start this stuff, our intuitions are to read what we see based on our own experience. And then when we train our intuitions, like the baseline piece, we get some information about, oh, what happens in their body is not what happens in my body. And so then we can update our intuition. But like we have to keep bringing it to consciousness in this setting with this person in order to train our intuition in relationship to reading this person accurately.
Right. So remember that picture of the head that I showed that said, okay, here comes, this event, and, our senses are taking in billions of bits of information, but then we filter it, and we filter it out, generalize, delete, distort. So in this activity, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, don't delete and or distort this information. I'm now paying attention to it, right? So we still, again, have that information within us, but now we are more consciously aware of it. And the more we practice it and look for certain cues, the more we are aware of these things, and we are training our critical faculty not to delete it, not to distort it, not to generalize it out, because this piece of information is actually useful. So yes, you use the word intuition. Someone might say it's a new map, right? And again, to Joe Navarro's point, it's not something that you can tell if someone's lying or not. That's not what we're saying, because we don't know what their baseline is. But we can certainly look for patterns, and in the Sherlock Holmes kind of way, we can make inferences. And inferences are assumptions that we will validate. We will check in with some other way to confirm, right? And this is how Sherlock Holmes stories tend to work. It's like, well, I'm looking at a hat. He doesn't know who the person is, but he can find out all of these things from these little tiny details. And so as we are shown these details, as we pay attention to these details, what do we infer? But we will need to check them, and then again, we start to build up patterns, and we start to recognize certain things that we didn't see before because we were oblivious to. So yeah, good stuff. All right. So let's continue. All right, so debrief. That was the science. All right, so putting it together, the magic and the science. So how much data are you working with when you make an assumption? So use your multiple brains, little nod to Bowler, to see more. So your gut brain, your heart brain, your heart and or your brain. So what do you sense? Again, 5+ senses. We talk about, sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell, right? But we have way more than 5 senses. I worked with a surgeon once years ago who said we have like 20+ senses. I'm like, okay. And that doesn't even talk about the extrasensory ones. And so based on this information, we make an inference, we model things. And again, the model is not the real world, but then we must validate that with outside information or with another person, another perspective. So what we're doing in these activities is we're training our neural network, literally our brains, to learn more about what we are seeing in front of us. And now I would sort of suggest you take this further, and that's what that little box in the corner is. You can continue on with additional things. So look into facial symmetry or asymmetry, micro expressions. I think it was Leslie who said, you know, sometimes the shift happens really, really quick. Yes, a micro expression happens in like half a second or less, and it's really quick, but it's very telling. The only thing I might caution you about micro expressions, I think I have a slide coming up on it, and there's always a caution, which is some of the studies that micro expressions are based upon say, oh, there's only 6 emotions. I'm like, yeah, no. There are outdated ideas of what our emotions are that sometimes is caught up in this, but the idea of the micro expression is that you can't hide what happens on your face. But if you're not watching, if you're not paying attention, you might miss it because it's really quick. Eye movement patterns. So Joe Navarro says, oh, well, when someone's eye goes up or something, it doesn't mean they're lying. No, however, when we understand certain eye patterns, for instance, you probably saw me just go up just now. That means that I'm accessing sort of my visual recollection or my creative side. If someone looks side to side, that means that they are hearing things. It's like, it's like, oh, what did that person say? You know, it's like, oh, or looking down, you know, so there are, again, more inferences that you can make based on the eye movement patterns. And this is really kind of cool. And earlier, you know, the voice, tonal patterns, word usage, frames of reference in terms of like, if someone is always talking about, oh, well, did you see what he did? Or it's like, yeah, that doesn't sound right to me. So when someone uses certain words like seeing or visualize or, you know, things that are in that realm, that means their preference is as a visual person. So then when you use visual words with that person, then you build rapport more quickly because you're more in alignment. So word usage is also something that you build up a skill over time. Don't just disregard certain words that people use. It's like you listen to their word usage and you can say, oh, they keep using all of these auditory words. It's like, did you hear what he said? It's like, oh, that doesn't sound right. I'm like, oh, auditory cues. Maybe this is more of a person who relates to things that they hear. So there's so much more to this world of paying attention to the physiology. And I would emphasize that again, the magic, listen to your intuition, listen to your feelings, as well as the science. These are things that you can train up and you can get better at. So then let's build on that building block. Let's return to our definition. A team is an interdependent group of people working toward a shared goal, right? So how are the individuals doing themselves? You know, how do you know? Like, and are you sure? These are questions we should ask ourselves. Again, inferences are okay, but then, you know, we can check in on them afterwards. So, and then once we have the building blocks of the individuals, what are their interactions like? Are there dependencies between people pairing, or are they trying to be independent? And then shared goals. How do we know that everyone is on the same page? What does that look like? And these aren't questions that we necessarily need to answer for ourselves. Some of them guide us, but some of these questions we also use in turn with the teams that we're coaching to say, how do you know that you're on the same page with that person? What did you see? What did you hear that leads you to that conclusion, right? So again, the questions are the powerful ones, not only for ourselves, but also as coaching questions. And then for remote teams, the questions that I leave with you is basically, what can you add to these list of questions or modify here to make the situation easier for you to know how to guide the individuals and the teams going ahead to achieve their goals. So the focus, start with the individuals. There's your atomic building block and build up from there. All right, so challenges when coaching remote teams. So on the left-hand side, we return to that picture that we had right in the very beginning, which was, oh, well, you know, when you see everyone all together, you can see their interactions. That's cool. But then when they're in this little window on the side, you're like, wait, like, I can't see those interactions, right? I'm like, here on the left, you know, I just put some numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can see the pairing. But now it's like, well, who's responding to who and how do you know? And that's really tough, right? So what do you see? What do you infer? And based on these inferences, what can you confirm, right?
A lot of us now are doing these video conferences, Zoom, Google Meets, and so forth. And the visual range has changed completely because now we're only seeing maybe from the chest up, maybe we're only seeing the face. One of the things we know is that in face-to-face meetings, this tends to be on a subconscious level very aggressive. So directly looking at another person, as I am now, directly looking at the lens, is actually creating discomfort, that we actually get greater comfort when we turn slightly. It makes the other person relaxed. And one of the mistakes that I'm finding on Zoom calls and Google Meets and other environments is this very direct, intense look at the lens. So one of the things that you can try next time you're on a video call is angle yourself and see if you find that more comfortable. See if it's more relaxed. See if in doing that behavior that the other person then does the same thing. They feel a little bit more relaxed. Maybe they lean back a little bit more. One of the things that I teach is that synchrony is harmony. So the more that I can get the other party to relax, to mirror my behaviors, the more I know that we are in synchrony. And that's powerful because we are both engaging each other at a conscious and at a subconscious level.
All right. I like that line. Synchrony is harmony. And a lot of us probably know the word synchrony as we talk about building rapport. So that's also a nice little tip for us going forward with Zoom meetings. All right, so, and again, I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the expression of all of the different emotions, beware of oversimplification. You know, in Joe Navarro's videos earlier, he talks about, well, let's just keep it fairly simple, right? Let's just, do you see comfort? Do you see discomfort? And there's certain cues that you can look for. Well, that's binary, and we know that's a little bit more complex than flipping a coin. And as I mentioned earlier, when you watch some of the micro expression videos or some of the work on there, then they talk about these 6 universal emotions. And the answer is no, they're not universal. But at the same time, beware the complexification. You don't have to figure out what all 300 of these are. Don't go down that rabbit hole. Don't get stuck on it. You know, this isn't Pokemon. You don't got to catch them all. So just, you know, be aware that there is a wide range of emotions, and it's important for us to be open to what we see and to make little notes on our inferences, but then check what those are. All right. And then that leads us to kind of like our last question here. Are there any puzzles, connections, ahas? Sort of open this up. Can't get my mouse back.
Black sheep.
Oh. I think a lot of it just is based on intuition. And I think you're right. It's a practice. And I love how you mentioned the 3 centers, the brain, the heart, and the gut. So really having self-awareness And then intuition into yourself will allow you to decipher the other.
That's right.
What about people who train in this full time and apply full time, and they're awful at it? That's what Malcolm Gladwell says in his book. It happens to law enforcement. They misread the cue, and it escalates in violence, or border patrol who misread it, or even CIA who can't find the spy within the spy agency. And they're trained in these things. I know that when we misread, it doesn't have a consequence. But when law enforcement misreads these things, and they're trained in this, the consequence of disastrous. Is all I'm saying. It's like here, yes, we should have this reading. Yes, Navarro did train them, but how come there are times when the consequences are much more disastrous than they should be when he trains law enforcement to apply it.
Right. Excellent point. There are additional models and patterns underlying the tools. So these are tools and techniques. The question is, how are you going to use this? For what purpose? And so in the context of what we're doing, these tools and techniques are here to help us to better coach teams and to better coach remote teams. Do we understand the people so that we can do this function better? Some of the system of what you are describing is what is currently under popular scrutiny of the system itself has underlying motivations which are not necessarily as well-intentioned, right? If the intention is to use the same techniques and tools in order to detect or assume that there is deception, that there is some harm that will come, then your model is moving already skewed and shifted in that direction. So you're bastardizing the tools in a way that they weren't intended to be used. Although actually perhaps in Joe Navarro's, again, and he tells you in his videos, he's like, I'm not a lie detector, I can't tell you this. But he's like, you can see patterns, you can make inferences. But then he would also be the first to say, and then you go and double check, you ask. And he's got some great stories about that. So yes, the FBI, the CIA, some of these other agencies, they use these techniques. But I would say that the underlying motivations are clearly not the same as what we're using. This particular circuitry sensing activity that we did today comes from NLP. And that's how I learned it. And NLP is a suite, a toolkit for helping people with traumas and addictions. And NLP has been taken and applied by salespeople and marketing people in order to manipulate the masses. Same tools, same psychology, but their ethics there is very much questionable. So when I use these tools, it's in the same sort of original mindset, which is how can I help you to be the best you, to interact better with those around you so that you can accomplish the goals so that you need, or how do I help you to get out of your own way? So when I use these tools, it's in the original spirit. I can't stop people from misusing these tools. And I think that's an interesting point. I don't know that we'll necessarily address it here today. So thanks.
Hey, Paul, I was just wondering, as we're going through all this, I'm thinking in a more inclusive world, I'm trying to put myself in the position of someone who has, maybe a visual impairment, a hearing impairment, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just trying to picture myself that, and how would this help? How do you apply this? If they're trying to understand me, if someone can't see me, but they hear me, you have to really be based on your tone then, right?
Yes.
So yes. That's the other thing you have to take into account too. Or am I just pushing off to a different world?
No, then you're no worse off than you are today, right? Which is, who here has made a false assumption based on reading an email? Right? So yeah, raise your hand. That's all of us. So because you are projecting your current state of mind, your state of being onto the words. You're filling in the gaps between the words with a context that the original person maybe didn't have. So the question is, if the words themselves represent 7 to 10% of the whole communication, anytime you feel an emotion, that's an inference. And I would just say, how can you check that? If it's with more words, cool. And then just give the person the benefit of the doubt, but get a couple of data points. Tonality is one where, word usage, people project, perception is projection, right? It's like your baggage is what you're projecting onto the words that you hear and the words that you see. So if you can't see more information, and or if it's skewed and you can't hear anything else, then your response is actually a better reflection of what's going on within you than it is in the original person. So as coaches, I think your question is totally valid, which is, in the times when we don't have the video on and we don't see them, we don't hear them, then you're working on at best 10% of the picture. So what can you infer? How can you find out more? So I would take that as a cue to say, oh, Alice, she wasn't here for that particular call. I don't really know what's going on with her. How about if I just give her a call? And if there's no video, there's no video. Just say, hey, how's it going? I need more data. I need more information. I'm not going to make an assumption. It's like, oh, well, Alice chose not to be there. She's not a team player. Like, no, I don't know that. And I'm not going to project that. But, actually, it was about 20 years ago. I first signed up to be an online instructor for a course at a time where there were not that many courses in 2001 that were online, and not a lot of successful ones, not a lot of good tools either. And I remember having this conversation why did I not like teaching online with the tools that we had, was because it was all through, I think, was it Moodle? Very, very old version of a sort of a teaching wiki called Moodle, that it was the best you got was I post something on a forum and I wait for someone to respond. It was just words and that was it. There was no conversations, there was no video. And when I asked the question, so do you get it? And then they reply back with yes. And I'm like, well, was that yes? Or was that yes? Was that yes? So it's like, and I'm like looking at this yes, and I'm like, I don't know if they really got it or if they're just humoring me so that I can move on, right? So that's the tough part, is that when you're only working on words alone, how can you find out more? What additional questions can you ask? It's a totally fair point. Not everyone's going to use video, but then you need something, some way to get more information. Cool.
Thank you.
Paul, I have another question. So the idea of, visual cues and even auditory cues. So when you try to have these conversations with leaderships, and you see a lot with political members as well, or people who are really public facing, they're sort of trained to talk in a certain way, trained to hold their body in a certain way. And you might, if you work in a big organization and you have a lot of senior execs, and you might see this. So how do you sort of apply these sort of techniques in that kind of environment?
Right. So if you can get visual, like if you can see them, one of the reasons why facial expressions is so powerful is because that's the part where the muscles, there's a lot of muscles on your face, on your head, and it's the closest to the skin, or your skin is the thinnest here, and the facial expressions cannot be hidden regardless of the words that they've been trained to use. And so you can actually still read their faces without hearing any of the words. And this is where I would say that the words are one thing, and I'm familiar with kind of the double speak, vague, multiple interpretations, kind of like language that some of the people have been trained to use to be non-political or apolitical or, you know, non-judgmental. And it's just like, yes, although I need more information, can you give me a straight answer? And politicians are the worst for this. But if you're familiar with the work of Oliver Sacks and the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, wonderful book full of these stories. So he was a famous neurosurgeon who looked at a lot of these disorders of the mind, and very curious things when, you know, the brain isn't working quite in a normal sort of way. It's like, well, what happens to these people? And there was this one interesting story that stuck with me for all these years, which was there was, I think this was during the Reagan administration, so sometime in the 70s. I mean, I don't remember this. I read this story and he's telling about the Reagan administration, and he was working at a mental hospital, and there were these people who could not pick up on normal social cues, just not there at all. And there was this television in their common room that had no audio, but they could see like the news and the things that were coming on. And there were certain people that whenever Reagan came on, they just started laughing. They just started howling. He's like, what's going on? I mean, it's the president, right? Like, politician, like, what's going on? And so he would talk to these people and say, well, why are you laughing? It's like, well, look at him, like, look at his face. He's clearly the world's, like, the country's most famous comedian, because his facial expression is just always radiating lies and, you know, misdirection. It's like, so he must be a comedian, right? And so the point here is, you know, regardless of the words, sometimes, in fact, even in spite of or completely delete all of the words, if you focus on the tonality, there's 35% of the message just in the way they express themselves. But if you can see them and ignore all of the words, you're still more than halfway towards understanding the meaning behind the communication. So I hear what you're saying, but the techniques that we were practicing here today, quite powerful. And I would suggest just keep practicing them.
Cool, thanks.
All right, we're kind of at time.
Sorry, are we out of our time box?
No, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting when we go back to a, you know, into a collective environment when people are having to wear masks, right? Because, you know, now you're losing half of the face, and they have to really listen, you know, pay attention to the eyes and tonality instead.
Yes, actually, in that Joe Navarro video, I only show you clips. One of the clips that I cut out for time was, well, what if people are wearing masks? I mean, you can still see the little crow's feet around the eyes and the cheeks, and you can still see enough information. You can see the furrowing of the forehead and the eyebrows, or the raising. You know, like someone was pointing out earlier, it's like you can still see the pulse rate, you can see the breathing. So there is still a lot of information that you can gather. Again, I would just suggest practice, although you're correct in that, you know, when you cover the mouth, it does hide a lot of information. And for some people more than others, especially those who, you know, have difficulties hearing, who are used to reading lips, this is really difficult for them because they're having a harder time concentrating. So for people who are used to lip reading and they're now talking to people wearing masks, you might see their brows furrowing, and it's not because they're angry or upset, or maybe they're a little frustrated because they're like, I'm really having a hard time understanding what you're saying, right? So, but yes, I would just say definitely that is a consideration, but there is so much more information that is radiating. And I would just say, keep practicing and see what you learn. Cool. Experiment. Anywho, just sort of looking at the time, I see that we're just about at the end here. So I will put on my Explorer cap and say thank you. And I hope that I've shed a little bit of light on the subject for you today. And I would encourage you to just keep practicing. All right. Thank you. So that was circuitry sensing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Very creative.